we've talked about Leviticus 25 in regards to Israelites being permitted to acquire foreigners as servants.
Yes, and I go into more detail on the implications of this passage in this video on my channel called Slavery in the Bible, Leviticus 25.
Right, but there's one thing I'm still not comfortable with, and you touched on it briefly, but not much. This idea that these foreigners became permanent servants of these Israelites.
Yes.
And the Israelite could pass these foreigners down to their children.
Correct.
So what's going on here?
Right, so I'll summarize the stage here for sake of time. The ancient Near East, a time in history that was astronomically different than what we know today, offered very little options. Today we're familiar with government assistance, welfare, social security, unemployment checks, bankruptcy, and other federal supports for citizens here in Western society.
Right.
We also know how something like the Great Depression, a stock market crash, or a banking crisis can really wound a society. It leaves affected citizens with only a few options.
True.
But in the ancient Near East, these kinds of crises could be disastrous. Regular waves of famine, war, and the fleeing of citizens these things created would have been devastating.
I can see that.
So what would it look like for an impoverished immigrant coming to another land? Well, one scholar notes this. Like many employees in the modern world, although legally free, a servant may have nowhere else to go and no alternative but to stay. So because of difficult economic times, both Israelites and immigrants in Israel often would have to enter into the service of another to be able to stay afloat.
Okay.
But this idea of permanent servitude wasn't too shabby of a situation. First of all, like I covered in the last video, a foreigner could become successful and even hire an Israelite who needed to enter indentured servitude.
Right.
But there's also a certain security we can relate to in our modern context, where we'd rather work for someone so we don't bear the brunt of responsibility as a front man.
Huh?
Well, for example, a number of years ago I ran my own carpentry and furniture business, but it didn't take long for me to get exhausted from handling everything like labor, the accounting, the sales, the customer service, the employees, the employee insurance. I just wasn't built that way. I wanted to enjoy my job, and so I took my carpentry skills and worked for another company building houses for a while. So for these foreigners who we learned in the last video could never own land, belonging under another roof ensured stability of having food, shelter, and possibly even a wage. You would become a part of these Israelite families, according to some scholars.
Sounds like a good situation.
And we gotta also remember the permanency option was available to both Israelites and foreigners. We see in Exodus 21 verse 5 and 6 that a servant could declare he loved his master and stay with him for life.
Right.
And so when Leviticus is saying the Israelite can bequeath these servants to their children, this is actually continued security for that foreigner. Because if his master dies, for example, should that servant be thrown out and forced to seek employment elsewhere? Or remain in the same arrangement under new leadership? Also, this permanency would only last a generation or maybe two.
Oh yeah?
Well, according to Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer, Egypt's pharaohs might bring back foreign prisoners of war, who would then work for the state. But within a generation or two, Egyptianization set in. These foreigners would intermarry, assimilate into the culture, take on Egyptian personal names and social practices, and become full-fledged Egyptians. The same idea would be true in Israel. This modern idea of handing slaves down one generation after another, to children, grandchildren, and beyond, just didn't exist in the ancient Near East.
Okay.
So, we need to remember the similarities between Israelites and foreigners. They both are called sojourner, alien, or servant. They both could be acquired. They both could improve themselves and prosper. And they could both be in service to another permanently, which again amounts to no more than 1 or 2 generations. Lastly, and where I think this is summed up perfectly, is in Leviticus 19:34, where the Israelites are commanded to love the foreigner the same way they love themselves and their native-born Israelites. Love is being applied to all parties here, and when we're patient enough to soak in this ancient context, that theme will become more and more clear.